In this section, we are going to discuss the changing character of political life during the Jacksonian era, an increasing participation, and the age of the common man. When we consider the characteristics of the age of the common man, we are looking for equality in the political arena. That is, heightened emphasis on equality in the political process for adult white males. We have a rise in interest group politics and sectional bias. We see a changing of styles when it comes to campaigning, so that politicians are trying to appeal to the votes of the common man. And we are also going to see an increase in voter participation. After all, we begin to realize that a vote is a vote. From rich or poor, it all counts the same. We begin our study of Andrew Jackson by looking a little bit before the corrupt bargain and the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson had been running for president, and he essentially won the popular vote among 4 different candidates. However, there was no clear winner of a majority in the Electoral College. It took over half of those electoral votes to be selected president. And because Andrew Jackson had the most, did not mean he had over half. He had the plurality, not the majority. Whenever there is a question in the Electoral College, as we learned with the election of 1800 and Thomas Jefferson, the decision has to go to Congress. Henry Clay withdrew his name from the race, allowing his supporters to go with John Quincy Adams, who in the end won the election over Andrew Jackson. What was so corrupt? Henry Clay was then selected to be John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State. It seemed to Andrew Jackson and his supporters that a corrupt bargain was struck behind closed doors, and the presidency was bought in exchange for a favor. Andrew Jackson, his supporters, completely outraged, decided to do something about it. In the following election, Andrew Jackson and his supporters ran again, and this time it wasn't as close. The election of 1828 saw even greater suffrage and greater political activism than we'd seen before. Nominating conventions were used as delegates worked through those to be sure that the better candidates were nominated for office. Americans were equal at the ballot box, and Jackson won. Jackson and his presidency initiated what we call the age of the common man, as a new democratic spirit is going to sweep across the United States of America. Again, Andrew Jackson's election came at a time when the vast majority of American men were participating in the electoral process. Suffrage was being extended. We were losing property rights and religious qualifications, so more American men were able to vote. And this is going to replace the previously aristocratic governments. That is, governments by the high society is being replaced by a government that's going to be responsible to and accountable to the common man. Andrew Jackson initiated his changes immediately. He initiates what's called the spoils system. That is, Jackson hired political supporters to fill government jobs. Those who were favorable to Jackson got those jobs. If those who were against Jackson lost their jobs. Andrew Jackson, being a famous general from the war against the British in 1812, Andrew Jackson says, "To the victor goes the spoils." That is to say, whoever wins the battle gets the spoils of war. And he saw government jobs as being the spoils of war. Andrew Jackson believed that this is going to increase the involvement in government by ordinary people. After all, It doesn't take a rocket scientist to do a government job, at least not back in the 1830s. But it did lead to more levels of corruption, and Jackson did have to handle some of the problems associated with that. One of Jackson's key obstacles were the Native Americans. When it came to American Indians, Jackson was in favor of Indian removal. Andrew Jackson wished to force the American Indians to reservations farther west across the Mississippi River, to move them from their long-standing native homelands and force them onto reservations where they could be watched. A Georgia eviction law was actually overturned by the John Marshall court case. The Cherokee Indians, one of the what's called 5 civilized tribes, realized they could not battle the American government and the American military. They knew they'd be slaughtered. They decided to challenge in court. They filed their court case claiming that their treaty needed to be upheld, that it was unconstitutional for Georgia to ask them to move. John Marshall heard the case. John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Indians were right, that they had every right to stay on the land that was allowed them based on this treaty. Andrew Jackson was furious. Andrew Jackson said, John Marshall made his decision, let him go to Georgia and enforce it. That led to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the journey that was the Cherokee Indians and many other Native Americans had to face as they were relocated, suffering brutal, harsh, horrific conditions, many dying, falling along the Trail of Tears. One would think that Jackson's refusal to back a Supreme Court decision would be cause for impeachment. After all, that's the president refusing to do his job. The effect on Andrew Jackson was just the opposite. He became more popular. He appealed more to the common man because his refusal to do his job benefited more Americans and seemed to only hurt the Native Americans. Jackson founded the Democratic Party, and that is the modern Democratic Party that's still around today. They began with several basic ideas. They supported extending political powers, extending suffrage, that is, the right to vote. The more common people who could vote, the more powerful they would be, and the more responsive the government would be to all the people. They opposed the national bank. We discussed a few modules earlier. The national bank seemed to Andrew Jackson to only favor the wealthy, only benefit those in the North. Andrew Jackson was what he considered to be a Westerner, and he saw no need for a national bank for the West or for the Southern farmers. He opposed Henry Clay, who supported a thing called the American system. Part of the American system included using public funds, tax dollars, to build up the infrastructure, to build a national road, to build up transportation systems on the interior. Andrew Jackson believed that these would only cater to the wealthy, again, only benefiting manufacturers, not helping out the farmers. And because this was so open to corruption, that idea to Andrew Jackson was offensive. When it came to Indian removal, as you might have guessed, Andrew Jackson said the Indians need to go. They need to be cleared out so that we have room to expand. But when it came to the issue of tariffs, that is taxes on imports, Andrew Jackson, he was somewhat undecided. He didn't know whether or not the government needed to have strict and harsh tariffs, though he did see some benefits. And the early Democrats were somewhat undecided, even split down the middle, though much later the issue of tariffs is going to cause Andrew Jackson to make his first stand to keep the Union together. When it comes to oppositions, Andrew Jackson did face some critics. While he was extending democracy, he was certainly upsetting some of the folks who were already in power. Remember, he is helping to replace the aristocratic style of government, that is, government by those who are wealthy. And he does have a few opponents. One of his groups of opponents that formed were the Whigs. They accused Andrew Jackson of being a tyrant. They saw him as a king. They felt he was taking too much power by opposing the bank and by opposing the American systems. And they saw his actions against the Indians as being, again, excessive when it came to his excessive power. Notable members would include guys like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. After Andrew Jackson and as his political party got stronger, another opposition party springs up called the Know-Nothings, and that's kind of an interesting term. While they said they knew nothing, they had a lot of very prominent views. They formed in the 1850s. Their big cause was being opposed to the increased immigration of especially the Irish. When it comes to the legacy of Andrew Jackson, he's a difficult president to analyze. We see the good, but we also see what might be considered the bad. Andrew Jackson had an extension of democratic participation. Between suffrage and the spoils system, more common people were able to take part. He did strengthen presidential power. Either for better or for worse, his action strengthened power, utilizing public opinion and the ballot box. He is also the first president to really utilize the presidential veto. While it's written into the Constitution, he was the first one to take it out and use it in more political effects. He would threaten Congress with vetoing certain laws that they were proposing, and he did, in the end, veto the National Bank. Of course, Indian removal is going to be a huge blight on the legacy of Andrew Jackson, as most Americans today look back at his actions, especially leading to the Trail of Tears, and see this guy was perhaps less than admirable. And ultimately, his actions, his economic actions, did lead to an economic crisis as he vetoed the National Bank and declared what he called a war on the bank. This caused many other smaller banks to tailspin out of control. They got more money, which they loaned out, and when speculators lost, the banks lost. And that led the nation into a terrible economic crisis that was nearly a depression of 1837. But Andrew Jackson had already left office and left his successor to deal with such a crisis.